Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to read to you chapter 2 of my ghost story mystery, Hallows House. This chapter is titled Miss Elizabeth Pike. Murder? I don't like the sound of that, Rachel. Mum, don't worry. It was ages ago, she said. Listen to this. It's from the Monk's Ferry Chronicle. It's dated the 1st of November, 1872. She smoothed out the wrinkled piece of newspaper and began to read. Murder at Monk's Ferry. The mysterious death of the only daughter of the late Mr. Alpheus Pike, Esquire, is occupying the attention of the authorities at Monk's Ferry. Miss Elizabeth Pike was found dead last night upon All Hallows Even at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening. Her lifeless body was discovered in the drawing room of the family's residence, the Old Hall in the town. Miss Pike was recently engaged to be wed to the Reverend Charles Griffin, vicar of All Hallows Church, and a recent engagement ball was held at the hall for family acquaintances and local dignitaries. Detective Sergeant Josiah Heath from the Monk's Ferry Constabulary was one of the first persons on the scene. He reports that the deceased lady was found slumped upon a sofa with a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, the obvious cause of death being strangulation. There were some signs of struggle, but little evidence could be found of any intruder, either on the premises or around the grounds. We are informed that heavy rain that evening had hampered a thorough search of the estate, and, we are to believe, any evidence has likely been lost. The deceased was discovered by the housekeeper, Mrs. Fogg, who entered the room to attend to the fire grate. When asked why she had not attended to her mistress earlier in the evening, she explained that she had been given firm instructions not to bother Miss Pike or her guests, but that later she had felt compelled to attend to the fire before she retired for the evening. We are told that the identities of the deceased's guests are still unknown, and that there was no other person or persons in the house that evening. An inquest will take place on the 4th of November. Rachel put the clipping down on the table and looked at me expectantly. "What do you think?" she asked. "Poor young woman," I said. "Do we find out what happened? Do the papers reveal who did this?" "Not that I can see," she answered, "though there are more clippings. Look at this one. It's about the engagement party." I drew the lamp closer and read out the date. The 14th of October, 1872. A couple of weeks before her death. "Yes," said Rachel. "It's in the City Mail, so it must have been a big event." I began to read. Grand Ball at Monk's Ferry. On Saturday last, a grand ball was held at the Old Hall, Monk's Ferry, to celebrate the engagement of Miss Elizabeth Pike, only daughter of local shipbuilder, the late Mr. Alpheus Pike, Esquire, to the Reverend Charles Griffin, vicar of All Hallows Church, second son of Sir Christopher Griffin, Esquire, and Lady Constance Griffin of London. This most brilliant affair was hosted by Miss Pike's brothers, Mr. Ebenezer Pike and Mr. Joseph Pike, architects of this town. In attendance were the Reverend Griffin's 4 brothers, Lieutenant Cornelius Griffin, Dr. Cuthbert Griffin, Mr. Clarence Griffin and Mr. Cecil Griffin. At this point I paused and looked at Rachel. All the brothers' names begin with the letter C. How odd. Rachel nodded and motioned me to continue. As well as many of the local gentry of the neighbourhood, numbering some 180 ladies and gentlemen, The ballroom at the old hall was tastefully decorated with Miss Pike's favourite blooms, the white lily, which were placed in pleasing positions, accompanied by evergreens and other flowers of many varieties. Wild red roses adorned the musicians' gallery, and the crests of both the Pike and Griffin families were hung resplendent above. The supper table was generously laid out in the dining room, and a most magnificent stuffed peacock in full plumage graced the top of the table, which was in turn presented with the best refined delicacies. We are informed that the peacock is the symbol of the Pike family. Due to the recent death of the cook at the old hall, Mr. and Mrs. Elijah Fogg from the Merry Monk Inn provided the victuals at very short notice. The only event that somewhat marred the evening's gaiety was the sudden illness taken by the wife of the Honourable Mr. Arthur Bertram, the Mayor of Monk's Ferry. Fortunately, the Reverend Griffin's brother, Dr. Cuthbert Griffin, was on hand to attend to the lady, and we are informed that Mrs. Bertram made a full recovery upon her swift return home. Despite this occurrence, dancing and merriment was kept up till a late hour, and it was agreed by the attendees that a most wonderful time was had by all. "What a magnificent occasion," I said, placing the newspaper clipping back down on the table. I can almost picture the grand ballroom laid out with beautiful flowers. But Rachel, to think that only 2 weeks later it would all end in tragedy. Yes, but Mum, as I said, it was a long time ago. Elizabeth Pike has been dead for, I don't know, 150 years or something. She's been resting over there in All Hallows graveyard long before even your grandparents were born. Even my grandparents? I laughed. Anyway, how do you know where she's buried? I don't know for sure, but it makes sense, doesn't it? She was going to marry the vicar of All Hallows, the Pike family's church. Seems obvious. In fact, I think we should go over there tomorrow and try and find the grave. I pushed my chair back with a scrape and stood up. Maybe, I said, picking up my plate. Don't you think it's fascinating, though? She said, noticing the reluctance in my voice. I do, but you were right. It's also gruesome, and I'm still unclear what all this has to do with us. Rachel looked disappointed. She handed me her empty plate, gathered up the papers from the table, and stuffed them back in the envelope. Well, I'll go over there by myself then. I sighed. Don't be like that, Rach. Be like what? She said. Be irritated with me because I'm not as eager as you to go traipsing through a graveyard. She shrugged. It's fine, like I say. I'll go by myself. I knew it wasn't fine, but I didn't want to aggravate the situation by saying anything more. I was still confused, though. What were we supposed to do with all this stuff? What was this quest that the Pike family appeared to have dumped on our doorstep? And why hadn't they followed up with this themselves if they already had the information? They'd certainly had time. Nearly 15 decades of time. I put the plates in the sink, turned on the taps, and added a squirt of green washing-up liquid to the hot water. I watched the small bubbles of liquid build to a froth. I heard Rachel get up from her chair. I'm going to bed, she said. I turned in her direction and nodded. Okay, I'll see you in the morning. Maybe we can look at this stuff again tomorrow. Sure, she said flatly. I'll try and speak to the neighbours too, I said. Perhaps they know something about all this. They may have known the Pike family. She nodded and walked to the doorway, then stopped and turned back to face me. The fish pie was good, thanks. You have Mrs. Locke to thank for that, I said, smiling. She returned the briefest of smiles and then disappeared through the doorway. Friday, the 2nd of November. The next morning was bright and sunny. I wandered into the kitchen, and looking through the back window, I caught sight of Rachel at the far end of the yard, dressed in her wellies and winter coat. She was poking about in the semi-wild bushes and fruit trees, now bare of both leaf and fruit. I knocked on the window to get her attention, and she looked back at me with a beaming smile. She waved something above her head that glinted in the sunshine, and mouthed words to me which I didn't understand. I shrugged, shook my head, and gestured for her to come back inside. "The key!" she exclaimed as she came through the back door. "I found out where the key fits. There's a wooden gate in the wall at the bottom of the garden. You can't see it because it's hidden behind all the overgrown bushes." "Ah, the secret door," I said. "Who knew? How on earth did you find it?" "If I tell you, you'll never believe me," she answered, looking down at her feet. "I might not, but I'm prepared to take the risk," I said, smiling. "Well," she said, "I had a restless night again and another vivid dream. This time I was on the other side of our garden, in the grounds of the old hall, and I could see a gate ahead of me, a bright red gate. It was open and I went through it, and on the other side was a beautiful orchard of fruit trees." She paused and looked up at me. "It was so intense, Mum. The dream, it was like I was there. I could hear bees buzzing and the smell of—" "Honey?" I interjected. "No, not honey," she said. "Mum, I'm being serious. The smell of, I don't know, a garden in the summertime, maybe. I knew you'd think it was nonsense." I reached for her hand and squeezed it. "Rach, I'm only kidding. If you keep having these dreams, we'll never need to rely on Mrs. Locke for information again. But seriously, perhaps looking at those old documents is rubbing off on you in some way, affecting your dreams." She pulled her hand away from mine. "If this is all in my imagination, then how do you explain the fact that the red gate from my dream actually exists and is in exactly where I thought it would be?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe it was mentioned in one of those papers." "I didn't read about it," she said firmly. I sighed inwardly. I really didn't need more confrontation with my daughter. "Okay, let's get some breakfast and then we can check this out together. Did you manage to open it with the key?" "No, the key fits, but it doesn't turn all the way," she said. "I'm going to need some help." Half an hour later, I donned my own wellies, warm coat and gloves. The bright, shining sun gave an illusion of warmth outside, but in reality it remained bitterly cold. Rachel had declined breakfast, grabbed a quick cup of tea, and returned to the garden. She was busy pulling away handfuls of dead bush and overgrown weeds from the area near the gate, using various old gardening tools she'd found in the shed. I joined her and watched as more of the worn red wooden gate came into view. "See?" she said to me excitedly, taking the key from out of her pocket and brushing away some of the dead weeds from around the lock. She placed the key inside the keyhole. It turned a little, but then stopped dead. "We need some WD-40, I said. "We need what?" said Rachel, screwing up her face. I laughed. "It's a lubricant spray. Your father used it all the time while he was renovating that old motorbike. Do you remember it?" She nodded. "Who could forget?" she said sarcastically. "It'll help loosen up the rust inside the lock," I continued. "There should be some in one of the boxes we brought from our old garage." I returned some minutes later, spray in hand, and after applying it to the lock, Rachel tried the key again. This time she was able to turn it all the way without much effort, and we heard a satisfying click. She smiled at me. "We did it," she said. I began searching the surface of the door with my fingers. Don't get too excited, I said. There's no door handle. I can't see a way of opening it. There used to be, though. Look at this mark in the wood, she said. Maybe if I just tug at the sides, it'll give way. It was evident, though, after much tugging, that the gate wasn't going to budge. Bloody thing, she shouted as she gave the bottom of the gate a sharp kick. This is useless. Rachel, I scolded, keep your voice down. She ignored me and kicked the gate again, this time raising her arms in frustration. Now what do we do? I frowned. I couldn't understand why she was so upset. It was just a gate. Have we got a crowbar? She said impatiently, looking towards the garden shed. We don't want to damage it, Rach, I said as she hurried across the yard. Look, why don't we go back inside and I'll make you a hot chocolate or something? You haven't even had any breakfast. We can come back out later. I don't want to go back in, she said, opening the shed door. I want to get this thing open. And I don't understand the urgency, I said. Why don't we leave this for now? Let's go round to the churchyard. You said you wanted to search for Elizabeth Pike's grave. I was hoping that a walk might calm her down, distract her a bit. Having said that, a walk through a graveyard wasn't ordinarily at the top of my places to visit list. She stopped and turned towards me. You didn't seem so keen on that idea last night, she said tartly. Yes, but that was last night, I said slowly. I was tired, and you know I'm not a big fan of graveyards. True, you are a bit of a wuss when it comes to things like that, she said. Thanks, I said. Do you want help getting this gate open? Rachel bit her lip and stared at the battered gate. I guess it'll still be there when we get back, she said. Yes, and so will its secrets, I said, adding quietly to myself, if it has any. The entrance to All Hallows Church lay just beyond the bend in the road on Monk's Ferry Lane. The long, meandering old coach road was still the main route into the town from Myrtleton Moors, from the east. The moors were a barren and inhospitable place during the colder months. At least that's what I'd been led to believe. It was said that during severe winters the town could be cut off by heavy snowfall and residents become trapped between the moorlands and the sea. It wasn't something that worried me, but Rachel thought it would be a good idea if we stocked up on tins of beans, just in case. We passed under the church's covered wooden gateway and started down the gravel path towards the old stone building. So, do we have a crowbar? Rachel asked. It was the first time she'd spoken to me since we'd left the house. I think Dad had one, didn't he? She continued. I shrugged. I've no idea. But he left you all his tools, didn't he? In the garage at our old house? I stopped and turned to face her. Dad left his tools because he moved into a flat with Claire or Chloe or whatever her name is, and there wasn't anywhere for him to put them. I got rid of most of them before we moved. Her name's Clara, she said. She has a cat called Bathsheba. Bathsheba, I scoffed. What a ridiculous name for a cat. She's nice, said Rachel. You'd like her. What? The cat or the girlfriend? I quipped. You know very well what I mean, Mum, said Rachel. I didn't answer. So do we have his crowbar then, she said. Yes. No, I don't know, I answered, shrugging again. We stood in silence for a moment. Then Rachel began walking back to the wooden gateway, gesturing me to follow her. She reached out a hand to touch one of the poles that held up the tiled roof of the structure. Did you know this is called a lich gate? She said. What? I said in confusion. I thought we were talking about cats or crowbars or something. She gave me a cautious smile. I thought I'd change the subject away from Dad, since you were getting annoyed. Well, it's still a touchy subject, Rach, you know that. She nodded. Yeah, sorry. I joined her inside the gateway and sat down on one of its recessed benches. So tell me about this, Lichgate. I learned about it at uni, she said. The word lich is Saxon for corpse, and the Lichgate was designed to protect the coffin or the body from the weather. The priest would perform the first part of the burial ceremony in here, and sometimes people would sit on these benches with the corpse and perform a kind of vigil, sometimes overnight. I was dismayed. Oh, I said, looking around. I thought it might have a cheerier definition. Rachel rolled her eyes at me. Mum, we're in a graveyard. What did you expect? I thought it might have something to do with weddings. Keep the bride dry, something like that. Well, it probably had that use too, she said, smiling. I took off my gloves and caressed the age-worn wooden surface of the seat with my hands. It was mostly smooth, but I could also feel some rough indentations under my fingertips. I peered closer. Over the years, parishioners had made markings in the wood. Some had carved their initials. Others had made little symbols such as crosses or hearts. I wondered whether these marks were made by people who had previously sat here during the long hours of vigil with a deceased loved one. Rachel stood beside me. These are curious, she said, looking down and stroking the random notches and grooves. Some of them look very old. Look at this one. The initials are VDA, and there's an arrow and a little fish carved next to the letters. Is that a fish? It's fish-shaped, I said. Well, someone long since gone has taken the meaning of that to their grave, she mused. Rachel, you're so morbid, I said mockingly. I tapped her on the shoulder and smirked. Come on, let's go and find us a grave. Halfway down the path, we paused to look around. In the distance, somebody with a very small dog on a lead was placing flowers at a graveside. Other than that, the churchyard was empty and quite silent. Gravestones of every description and age, some sitting upright and some perched at more precarious angles, were lined up in untidy rows around the church building. Rach, this is going to take forever. We have no idea where Elizabeth Pike would have been buried, I said. I know, but I've been thinking about it, she said. The Pikes were a prominent family, and so I imagine that she'd be in the older section of the graveyard in a grand arrangement of graves, a family plot or something. Why don't you start at one end, and I'll start at the other? In the really overgrown bit? I asked, reluctantly. Rachel nodded a yes, and headed off in the direction of the old hall. Its roof could be seen peeking above the trees beyond the church's boundary wall. I set off down a smaller weed-strewn path towards the back of the church. Good job you've got your wellies on, she shouted over to me, grinning. It was my turn to roll my eyes. I searched among the seemingly endless rows of old gravestones for what felt like an hour. I was just about to give up, because the cold and wet from the long grass was starting to seep through holes in my wellies and into my socks, when I heard Rachel shout out at the top of her lungs, Mum, found it! She was waving at me frantically from an area close to the church's eastern boundary wall. When I got to her, she was knelt next to a large, dirty white marble gravestone and brushing off excess debris from its surface. She looked up at me. She's here, she said. Thank goodness, I said. I was just about to call it a day, Rach. My socks are soaked. You need new wellies, she said. I hunched down next to her and peered at the inscription on the stone. Can you read it? I asked. Yes, just about, she said. It says, "Sacred to the memory of Elizabeth Pike, mistress of the Old Hall, loving and only sister of Ebenezer and Joseph, taken from this mortal life on Hallows Even, October 1872, aged 24 years. Sweet sister, high-born, in spirit and in life, she lived and she laughed and she loved. Short was her stay in this world, cruelly stolen from our sight. Now residing between the earth and the heavens, we shall not rest until her soul is freed." Wow, that's unusual. "We shall not rest," I said, quoting the last line of the inscription. "Until her soul is freed," finished Rachel, turning her head to look at me. "Do you think that's what we have to do, Mum? Help them to free her soul?" I squinted at her in disbelief. Had I really heard her correctly? "What do you mean? Help who? And to do what?" "Them," she said, pointing to the names of the Pike brothers on the grave. I stood up. "Seriously, Rach," I said. What was she talking about? "Look, it says she's stuck between the earth and the heavens, in limbo." "I can see what it says, Rachel," I said, "but this was written a long time ago, when people were inclined to believe in this kind of thing. I said it was unusual, nothing more. It doesn't mean anything." "But you wanted to know what all this had to do with us," she said, getting up from her kneeling position. "Why did the stranger visit us and drop off the parcel? Maybe this is it. Maybe Elizabeth Pike and her brothers can't rest until her murder has been solved." "You're kidding, right?" I said, shaking my head. "No, I'm not kidding," she said plainly. "Rachel, I don't know where this is coming from. You don't normally believe in this kind of irrational nonsense." She bit her lip, looked to her feet, and stayed silent as I continued. "We still don't know what happened to this woman after she was murdered. Perhaps they caught the perpetrator years later or sooner. As you said to me, she's been lying in this grave for nearly 150 years. Why would the family's descendants feel a need to contact us with fragments of old papers and a key?" She stayed silent. "What do we have to do with any of this? It's ridiculous. To save their souls? What you're suggesting is ludicrously far-fetched, Rachel, and even if it was true, then why can't they do it themselves? They've certainly had enough time." Rachel began to turn away from me, then seemed to have second thoughts, and suddenly shot back to face me. Her cheeks were hot with anger as she shrieked, "You're impossible sometimes. You never listen to me. You're not the one who's been having all these stupid dreams and no sleep. The murder was never solved. I don't know why I know that, but I do. What other assistance could we give to these people, this family, if it wasn't to find out who her murderer was, so that they can all rest in peace?" She pointed to the gravestone and stared furiously at me. "Look, it says so there, no matter how far-fetched you think it is." I paused for a moment, unsettled by her anger. Then I began to speak slowly. "Rachel, do you hear what you're saying? A random stranger delivers some old documents to our front door on a rainy Halloween evening and suddenly we become Ghostbusters?" "I said you're impossible," she screamed, then wheeled around and strode off in the direction of the gravel path and exit. I watched her stomp away and eventually slip under the lich gate. After that, I lost sight of her. I was stunned and shaken. What on earth was all that about? I was confused and concerned by her outburst. What had provoked such an overreaction and such a ridiculous idea? One of the last people to believe in all things supernatural was Rachel. didn't make sense. I had to put it down to her recent lack of sleep and the stress of the move. She'd been through a lot over the past few months. It was probably best to leave her to calm down. If I knew my daughter, as well as I hoped, she'd have cooled off by the time I got back home, and then we might be able to have a sensible conversation. I gazed down at the marble gravestone. Who knew that a pile of old documents could cause so much upset? As I was replaying in my head what had just happened, I noticed something else at the bottom of the stone. There were additional words. I hunched down, brushed away a few more weeds, and read. Also, to the memory of Ebenezer Alpheus Pike of Hallows House, who died suddenly the 5th of September 1911, aged 68 years, and to the memory of Joseph Pike of Hallows House, who was tragically lost at sea, aged 77 years, on or about the 7th of May, 1920. Death shall not hinder the search for truth. Tragic story, that, said a man's voice, suddenly from behind me. Startled, I stood up from my crouched position and turned to face the direction of the voice. I realised it was the person with the dog that I'd seen bent over a gravestone when we'd first entered the cemetery. "Didn't mean to make you jump," he said. "I heard a bit of shouting and thought I'd best come over, see if you needed any help, like." "Oh, we're fine. I'm fine," I answered with embarrassment. "But thanks for your concern." I had no idea we'd been overheard. "I come out here most days. It's the missus, you see. Over there." He pointed back towards the grave he'd been tending. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said. "No need," he replied plainly, and we stood in a bit of awkward silence. I cleared my throat. "You said something about a tragic story?" and nodded towards the Pike family's grave. "Yes, tragic," he repeated. He turned and pointed to the disused manor house in the distance. "My great-grandfather Albert was brought up in that old house when the Pikes lived there. Grand place at the time. Not now, though," he said, shaking his head. "He would have been about 14 when the mistress was murdered." "The mistress?" I asked. "You mean Elizabeth Pike?" "Yes," he answered. "The one in the grave. Although locals knew her as Lizzie, of course. Kind woman from all accounts. Her portrait hangs in the town library. Think there's one of her father too. Alpheus was his name. Bit of a philanthropist around these parts, he was." "Oh," I said in surprise. "My daughter works in the library, part-time." "Was that her? The girl that was shouting?" he asked. Yes," I said uncomfortably. "We don't normally argue." He nodded, and we stood in silence again. Then, without any prompting from me, began to speak again. "She was murdered, you know, in her own home. My great-grandfather Albert was at the funeral. His mother was housekeeper at the old hall. That's what it's called. The manor house over there." "Yes, I know," I said, looking over at the crumbling stone building. "What was her name, your great-great-grandmother?" "Deirdre. She was there too, of course. Tragic. All the town came out. To her funeral, like." Then he paused and reached down to ruffle the top of his tiny dog's head before continuing. "After that, the brothers, one of them's buried here with her, you know," and he pointed down at the Pike's grave. "They were, by all accounts, heartbroken. Couldn't live in the old hall any longer. Haunted by something, they say. Her memory, maybe. Some say her ghost. but I don't believe in such things. I nodded. No, neither do I said. It sounded as though there were others in the town who also believed this story had a supernatural element. Which is why they built the new house over there, he continued, pointing to the roof of our house, which you could see a glimpse of through the trees. Not so new now, of course. They called it Hallows House. After they moved in, they abandoned the old hall and eventually it went to rack and ruin. Nobody would have it. That's where I live, I said, in Hallows House. Well, part of it anyway. We only discovered its name last night. Aye, he said. Been empty for a while. Your part at least. We moved in a week ago. Me and my daughter. We had no idea that it had been one big house until yesterday. Do you know why they split it into two? Well, after the brothers died, he answered, neither wed. There were no descendants, you see. Hallows House was sold 1920s, I think. My father would remember if he were alive. I nodded. So whoever bought Hallows House divided it into two? He nodded and then stamped his feet against the cold. The little dog looked imploringly up at him. It had begun to shiver, despite its smart red jacket. Anyway, must be getting along, he said, picking the dog up in his arms. Thank you for the information, I said as he began to walk away. It was nice to meet you. He nodded. Then, just as he was halfway down the gravel path, he turned back and shouted over to me. They say there are ancient underground passages about this place, all the way from the old hall down to the priory and the river, for smuggling and the like. I'm Stanley Fogg, and this is Bella. He pointed to the dog in his arms. If you want to know any more, I'm at Catlow Cottages, number 2. Just ring the bell. I waved in acknowledgement and shouted a thanks back in his direction. When I returned home, it was clear that Rachel was back. She'd thrown her coat over the banister and kicked off her boots, which had landed in just the right place for me to trip over them. I picked them up and placed them neatly under the stairs. I went through to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The ends of my fingers were frozen despite my woolly gloves. I put some wood in the grate, lit the fire, and then with some effort pulled off my wellies. My socks were soaked, so I hung them up next to the fireplace and settled into the wooden rocking chair at the side. A hot mug of steaming tea would be a welcome relief from the cold and damp outside. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps slowly coming down the stairs. Rachel came into the kitchen with a brown envelope tucked under her arm. She'd twirled the bit of old string from the parcel around her index finger. Throwing herself down on the comfy chair opposite me, she said, "Don't say anything." I held up my hands to show her that I wasn't going to say anything. "You're right," she said, biting her lip. "You were right back there. This is ridiculous. I'm ridiculous. I don't even believe in this stuff. I don't know what's got into me. Saving dead people's souls, what was I thinking?" I began to speak, but she continued before I had the chance. "I think I'm just tired, Mum. But you were right. What does any of this have to do with us? We should probably keep the key, but this stuff should go on the fire." She held out the stranger's package over the crackling flame and was about to let go when I reached over and pulled her arm back. "No, Rachel," I said slowly. "Don't do that. I don't know what's going on either, and I'm not sure that I'll ever be convinced that this has anything to do with saving someone's soul. But what I do know is that I'm still curious, and I'd like to find out more. But only if it's not going to cause you any more stress." "Are you sure?" she asked quietly, holding the envelope still precariously close to the flames. "Yes, I am," I answered, taking the envelope from her. "First things first, we should go to the library and visit Elizabeth Pike." And that ends the second chapter of Hallows House. Next time we'll read chapter 3, The Library. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.